We live? We are. Order, it's a pleasure to have the Secretary of State for Defence with us today and his team to give evidence to the committee. Secretary of State, do you want to just start by introducing the team you've got with you today?
Sure, here with the Permanent Under-Secretary. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
David Williams, Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence.
Tom Wipperman, Director for Strategic Finance, Ministry of Defence.
Lieutenant General Rob McGowan, Deputy Chief of the Defence Staff for Military Capability.
Good to see you all. Kevin's going to kick us off with the first question.
Yeah, I think you'd expect us to start with the budget. And since the budget on the 6th of March, there's been some uncertainty whether or not defence expenditure is rising or being cut next year. So an open question to start with. Could you clarify what the position is?
I kick off and then hand over to Tom. So I think the confusion on the day is that when the Treasury publishes their numbers, you're not comparing apples with apples. You're comparing apples with oranges because they publish the entirety of the outcome, the outturn of the previous year, 23-24, including supplementaries, which includes things like Ukraine expenditure, for example. And then when you see the figures for 24-25 on the day in the book, it doesn't include the supplementaries, even though everyone knows, because the government's already committed to it, that, for example, that's £2.5 billion, and then money for munitions as well, 280 million for stockpiles. Once you add those two things in, which are then comparing the outturn of last year to what will be the outturn of this year for certain, you get a 1.8% real terms increase,
right,
and £1.4 billion.
What you're basically saying
increase.
is what's in the red book figures.
It's misleading because it doesn't include a footnote that says that doesn't include supplementals.
Oh, well, let's get it clarified then. So let's do Ardell first. So according to the red book, for 22-23 it was 30.5, and then for 23-24 it's 35, and then for 24-25 it's 32.8. So what are the figures then, taking out what you've just said, on the figures for 2022, 23 and 24?
Yeah, so to compound those figures, you end up with a 54.2 billion the previous year and a 55.6 this year. But I know you want to get into the details, so I'm going to ask Tom to give you the actual
I'm doing
numbers.
it deliberately separate between,
okay.
Because I know in your tweets you have a tendency to conflate
CDL and Ardell.
Well, and conflate things that frankly don't add up, but go on, carry on.
So, Mr. Jones, so if you look at the 23-24 number is our outturn, which was which reflects the supplementary estimate published in February. The Ardell 35 billion compares to plans.
No, can I just stop you?
Yeah.
Right. So the Secretary of State just said the 32.5, and you've just said, and I understand that, has got supplementary. What is the figure? Stripping that out. That's what we're trying to get to.
So, sorry, do you mean 22-23?
Well, let's start with 22-23.
So that is 32.5. That is the outturn from that year.
That includes what the Secretary of State you just said.
Yes. So the outturn. Yeah. So the outturn for 22-23 includes the additional spend.
Got all that
in that year.
You don't need to expend it. We've got that.
Right.
Strip that out then. What was the figure for 22-23? Because that's the only, what you're saying is the supplementaries really skew things, so you can't, as the Secretary of State just said, you're not doing apples and oranges.
No,
so what we really need to get to is what is strip out all the supplementaries in 2022-23 to get a baseline, and then go on to 2023-24 to see what that is, with stripped out all that's how we're going to get, and that's what we would need.
I do understand the question. I think if I may, I would suggest if we could do it the other way around, starting from 24-25, and the reason for that is that the outturns that you see reflect the things that went in that year.
Look, sorry, you don't need to explain it. We've got it.
Okay.
Right. What we're trying to get to is, which is what the Secretary said, we're trying to get to is what is the baseline in terms of take out all the supplementary things that. We actually want to get what the baseline, the way you can tell whether it's increased or decreased, is so you must have a figure. We take all that out for 2002 to 2023, so we've got that baseline, then get the same figure with everything stripped out for 2023-24, and you compare them two together, you can see whether it's increased or decreased.
If I may, Mr. Wipperman may want to correct me, that the number that we focus on manage in the department is our expectation of the budget after supplementaries each year, and the data we then report, and I think we probably have to hand with us, is the outturn for previous years, including those supplementaries. We can answer the question you want, but it requires to go back to the main estimates for each of those previous years, and I don't think we have the main estimates.
Wait a minute, though. But if you talk about transparency with the public and Parliament, the Secretary of State, Mr. Wipperman, has just argued that it's increasing, right? Now, according to the book, it's not increasing.
No.
Now, what we need to know, and what the Secretary of State just said, is the only way really to do it is to strip out the supplementaries. And that's where we need to get to. So why can't you produce those figures? Because that's the only way we can, no disrespect to you, say that what the Secretary of State and you're saying is correct.
Well, it's just that the matter of record for previous years is the audited figures from the NAO, which is the end-of-year outturn that includes the supplementaries. So our proposal is easier to compare 24-25 with our expectation of what's going to be in the supplementary estimate, rather than the book figure. We could answer the start point of each year. It's just that would be the figure approved by Parliament in main estimates each year, but it's not particularly a number we plan against because we expect it to change, and I just don't think we've got. Well, I haven't.
So I do have
on these figures there. It's going down.
So I do have a TDAL number, which I don't have the Ardell CDAL split, and we can run. So the total budget, so Ardell and CDAL combined, 22-23. These are nominal, so they're not adjusted. But 22-23, 49.9 billion. 49.9 billion prior to reserve funding. 23-24, 51.5. 24-25, 51.6.
What was the last one?
51.6. Those are totals, so that's Ardell and CDAL prior to agreed reserve claims that took place during those years. Those are nominal, they're not real, so they are.
It's nominal, so it's pre-inflation.
Pre-inflation.
Actually, that's not.
This is all
49.9 to 51.6. Those are the numbers, Tom.
That's right. In total spend prior to.
That's probably a reduction in real terms.
What is inflation?
following year is. Yeah.
It is a reduction in real terms, taking inflation, but what within those figures you just given us is not core expenditure? I mean, is that included in that, for example, support to Ukraine?
No, so that wouldn't include because that's all the reserve funding that comes in.
That's how you try to.
Helpful. It's trying to get a clear picture.
I think the point is just that the main estimate figures tend to relate to core spending as agreed in the spending review. They don't agree on uplift for Ukraine. They don't agree additional funding allocated to the department in the autumn statement in 2022. In the spring statement in 2023. So it is a baseline that the Treasury use, but when you're comparing year-on-year growth, outturn to plans plus planned for supplementaries is the best measure. And that's
much of that comes from the contingency reserve, which has always been accounted for differently. You know as well as I do, this is all deliberate smoke and mirrors, David.
No, it's not deliberate smoke and mirrors, because the claim from the reserve comes through the defence budget in the end. And is reported in our annual report and accounts. It's audited by the NAO. It's the authoritative figure on what we have spent.
It is, but the problem is with that, though, and it's interesting, when I was in department, it was one of the things the Conservatives always said, you should take out, for example, the expenditure on Afghanistan and Iraq. So we're now saying that we shouldn't have done that, or we shouldn't. So the arguments that Mr. Shapps and others were making at the time was wrong.
Look, I just think if the argument is should we spend more on defence, as government agrees, we're committed to 2.5%. Not all sides of the House agree with that.
Can I stop you there? Because we're going to get onto that later on.
Okay, but I mean, it's within this context.
Hang on, we'll get onto that later on. But other people have got questions on that, so I don't really want to eat their sandwiches. Do we need to, and I know you're very good at flanneling and making the positive statements, but what we need to do is do the detail. And it's important as a committee, and I think for the public as well, they get an understanding in terms of the actual figures rather than what you put in a tweet, for example.
Well, just to be fair though, you can't take the outturn of 23-24 and somehow include supplementaries and then compare it with the projection for 24-25 and not include supplementaries, because that's then you not being consistent.
No, well, I am.
And all I'm doing is being consistent.
No, you're not being consistent at all. I was trying to be fair to try and get... I was trying to be fair with you to try and get an understanding so we can actually get to the bottom of it, what the claim is. And I think, fair to David, he's gone through that in terms of explaining how the actual outturns come around, which is fine. Which those figures that Mr. Wipperman just outlined, that's fine. I have a better understanding of what you're suggesting now.
Mark, do you want to come in?
Yes, please. Look, for people that are watching, and we're talking about estimates and outturns and supplementary estimates, so let's just go right back to the basics. This is the budget red book. This is the document that gives the detail, the small print, if you like, after a budget. And it lists the revenue spending for each of the departments, their limits, known as RDEL, and their capital spending limits, known as CDEL. So, and it lists each department. So if you look at the RDEL list, which is table 2.1 on page 25 of the report, take a comparison with education. So the education budget for 2023-24 is 81.9 billion, and then for 24-25 it's 84.9 billion. So it's gone up £3 billion. So far, so straightforward. When you do the same for the MOD budget, the core budget, it goes from 35 billion in 23-24 to 32.8 billion in 24-25, so the financial year that is just about to start. So that's a cut of £2.2 billion in the core defence budget. Now, when you do that for capital, it goes from 19.2 in 23-24 to 18.9 in 24-25. So that's another 0.3 billion, 300 million off. So when you add the two, that's £2.5 billion. Now, I'm not a qualified accountant, but I was a Shadow Treasury Minister under Osborne for 3 years in opposition, so I learnt to read this document by application. The amount we're giving to Ukraine next year is 2.5 billion. So it's almost exactly the same as the cut in next year's core defence budget. So what you tried to do, and that is always traditionally paid for out of the contingency reserve, just as we did with the Falklands War and most other conflicts. It's always been the way. So if you compare apples and apples, that 2.5 billion that goes to Ukraine is not part of the UK defence budget, because you can't spend the same pound twice. So if you're spending it on shells for the Ukrainians, money well spent, you can't spend it on army salaries or on submarine maintenance or on new runways for the Air Force. So what you've done is you've suffered a massive defeat at the hands of the Treasury. You've had your budget cut by £2.5 billion, and you're now trying to play smoke and mirrors with the Ukrainian money to pretend that your budget hasn't been cut when it's been slashed. Aren't you, Secretary of State?
No.
You absolutely are.
Well, let me answer. I disagree. And actually, the problem with the numbers you've written out is they are read out as they are in themselves misleading, because the previous...
They're in the budget red book. Now hang on, it's the official document of the government.
Okay, however, if you give me a moment here, and by the way, you and I start from the same place. We both want to spend more on defence. This government's committed to spending more on defence, and I absolutely agree. The government is committed to 2.5% as conditions allow. Other parties are only committed to 2%, so they certainly are. But nonetheless, the reason why those numbers come out as misleading is simply because the previous year's figure you read includes the supplemental. The next year you're reading doesn't include the supplemental. And the argument is simple. You either have to include it entirely or you don't include it entirely, as Mr. Jones was offering up previously. You can't include it on one and then not include it on the other. If you do, then the 2024 figure, which you presented, which was, I think, in your terms, 35 billion, or if I look at the total TDEL, 54.2 billion, the 23 figure goes down as well. So you'd be arguing that the defence budget was reducing every year, including into the past years as well. The only way to look at this is as the NAO looks at it in the audited accounts, which is it does end up including supplementals, which isn't just the 2.5 billion, though the number, as you pointed out, would conveniently suggest. It's also Dreadnought, it's also stockpiles, it's also other operations.
If you want to draw in the NAO in evidence, in their equipment plan report, recently reported on by the PAC, you've got a black hole over the equipment plan of £29 billion.
Again, misleading, because...
so the NAO and the PAC are wrong as well?
It's misleading, and the reason is this. That equipment plan is £288.6 billion over a 10-year period, of which only 25% of it is committed, and it assumes, when the NAO looks at it, that we don't get to our 2.5% stated public position of defence expenditure,
hang on a second.
which this government says it's committed to.
I do. Secretary of State, everyone can see what you've done. You've been defeated by the Treasury. You are slap bang guilty of Enron accounting, and you're trying to blow smoke in everybody's eyes by using Ukrainian money and pretending it's part of the of the UK defence budget. It's not. It's part of the Ukrainian.
Mr. Francois, you're doing exactly the same. You are using Ukrainian money from last year and including it in the budget, and then saying, but you can't include it in this year's budget, and then coming to misleading conclusions.
No, because normally the Red Book, these are what an accountant would call accounting adjustments. So you've got a total, and then there are some differences to the total, and you record why the two numbers are different, right? The Red Book barely mentions defence at all. We have a Chancellor that has no interest in defence. We all know that. Why then aren't these supplementals footnoted in the Red Book? Why aren't last year's supplementals footnoted in the Red Book?
I join you on the campaign to have those footnoted, but it cannot be right to claim the inclusion of other expenditure, including the supplementals for a range of different issues, in 1 year, and then look forward and say, but we're not going to include them, unless you think that we're not going to make those contributions, for example, to Ukraine or Dreadnought or other operations or the stockpiles, all of which are already declared. And in defence of the Chancellor, he has spoken himself about 4% in the past.
Yes.
So I don't think he has no interest in defence.
Well, in simple pub English, you're cheating.
No, I think it's the other way round. I'm sorry. I want to push back very, very strongly, but respectfully.
Well, I feel very, very
because
strongly.
you are deliberately quoting figures, including supplementals, and then not comparing apples with apples when we look at this year. I think we either have to do both or neither.
Secretary of State, I think we should now draw a line on this debate but I think it illustrates one particular point, which is that we've discussed for 8 minutes what the historic numbers are that you've presented. There's something wrong in the formulation that we should have this length of debate. And given that the message that we need to send to adversaries is one of confidence in the funding streams you're getting and all the rest, we clearly need to do better in terms of presenting the numbers that you are receiving. Just a couple of questions. I mean, the numbers that Mr. Wipperman presented on TDEL, that would suggest a fall in real terms. Yep. I would have thought, just to leave that with you. And the other major question is, what matters is what you can plan for in terms of your budgeting. And so supplementals are great, depending on where they come during the course of the year and whether you can actually then apply them to what you can actually budget for. So I think maybe you could write back to us as to the thought process when you know, and this have already been announced, and they are subsequent to the spending round, and I appreciate that, absolutely appreciate that point. But in terms of when you are doing your planning, knowing that you have that money guaranteed with the Treasury, you're going to get it, Parliament's still going to vote it, but you're going to receive it. So we actually know when you're doing your planning what the forecasts are that you're working under. I think that would be a logical...
Yes, it would, and I think that would be... I mean, we can write separately, but I would expect to set that out in our estimates memorandum for main estimates. I know we were, for technical reasons, a little late in sending you the supplementaries this year.
Yes.
The estimate memorandum for the supplementaries does set out the increase to the baseline for 23-24. I'm happy to set out what we are currently planning on in the main estimates memorandum, if that's the most convenient way, or we can set it out directly.
You appreciate what we're, Mark, so you appreciate
I'm curious that you were late this year.
Generally, it was an IT.
Yeah, of course it was.
As well.
I think our concern is what budget do you think you have to spend? And we are all 100% in favour of 2.5. Many would like it to be more on not only just 2.5 in terms of percentage, but 2.5 in terms of Ukraine. But clearly, as Ms. Francois says, that's not money that you could be spending necessarily on the UK. So all hugely supportive of it, but we're trying to ensure that we know whether you have got an increasing amount of money into the budget in real terms or not.
So we can set that out, and if it's some comfort from the Red Book, or at least I think his remarks during the spring statement, the Chancellor said his expectation is that we will be spending 2.3% of GDP in 24-25, which is not the number that's in the Red Book.
And that includes 2.5 billion for Ukraine, which is 0.1% of GDP.
Yeah.
Kevin, then Derek, and then I'll come
Yeah, it's interesting what the Secretary of State said about the NEO report, because it didn't stop you in 2009, for example. The NEO report, equipment report, which says that if there was a £6 billion black hole in the equipment budget then, 30 billion if it was flat cash for the next 10 years. It didn't stop you as a party and your party arguing there was then a £36 billion black hole. So I think it is, I agree, how you actually read NEO reports and not use them like the Conservative Party did in 2010 to put something forward that was completely fictitious. But can I just clarify one thing? I mean, can I thank you, Mr. Wood, for your figures there, because I think that clarifies it for me. And as the Chairman says, it is a cut, isn't it? The TDEL figures.
So those nominal numbers probably are a real cut.
Yeah, thanks.
Just to follow on, just so maybe to aid try and enlighten me on my confusion, given the various figures that have been bandied around, just so we're clear for the record. Secretary, are you saying that in real terms defence spending is going up?
As long as you include the supplementals, then this year, in real terms, the spending goes up by 1.8% or 2.6 in nominal terms, 1.8 in real terms. And you know, as I say, it's for people watching this who are now completely confused. The simple question is: do you include things that came in last year and then were included in the so-called Red Book, and then ignore them this year, or do you include them? Once you include them this year, you end up spending £55.6 billion on defence. So we're.
So why do you think Why do you think that Malcolm Chalmers?
Derek, I think the first. Sorry, if Ms. Williams wanted to add something in there, and then you come back, Derek.
That figure is based on us adding in for 24-25 additions to the budget that have already been agreed and announced. It's not us having a punt on what we would quite like to see.
Yeah, it's an important point. Okay, Derek, thank you. The bigger picture, Secretary of State, is getting to that 2.5%. Now, you'll be pleased to hear that I was quoting you to the Prime Minister in the Liaison Committee not long ago, and your wise words about the necessity of getting to 2.5% and pre-war, and also I didn't actually mention your aspirations to go beyond 2.5%, and yet the Prime Minister didn't commit to a time and a date for the 2.5% and the uplift. Are you able to enlighten us now?
I'm certain the Prime Minister would have told you an hour ago if that was going to be an announcement for today. But the government is committed to 2.5%. It is, my view, as you know from my speech in Lancaster House in January, that we are living in a more dangerous world, and I use that post-war to pre-war phrase to describe why I think the challenges are greater, and I'm in complete agreement that you have to pay for that defence. Exact timing, as we've said all along, is a matter for the Chancellor, and the government's described it as being as conditions allow. Well, I'm the Secretary of State for Defence, so obviously I urge for us to move to that position as quickly as possible. There will be other opportunities, including an election coming. Other parties are only committed to 2%. The NATO base, that's about a £7 billion a year cut to the current defence spending picture. So 2% is about £7 billion less than we spend at the moment per annum.
That's just complete spin as usual.
Kevin.
It is, well, you know.
But, I mean, as I say it,
the bloke doesn't
there will be choices, won't they? There will be choices come a parliamentary election for different views of this, and
but you're
we are
cutting the
committed
defence
to.
Kevin, can you go through me, please?
Yeah, but you're cutting the defence budget now.
Well, as we've just heard, it's a 1.8% real increase if you include all of the supplementaries, because you're not including, again...
Include the figures that Mr Wimple just said, and
again,
go on those rather than what you spin.
Well,
I know it's a difficult thing for you to do, not to spin things as you actually like.
Mr Jones, I
deal with facts.
I'm sorry, but the facts,
now.
we've had a long time on that, and the facts are, once you include the supplementals, we're spending more this year than we did last year. That is the
things
fact.
that aren't necessarily for core defence expenditure.
Well, I think
we've had enough debate on it. So there are many other things we can discuss other than the numbers. I said 10 minutes ago that we'd already spent 8 minutes on this. We now spent a quarter of an hour. So no, you can't enlighten us on the timing. But you can say this is an absolute priority for you, and I assume that has implications for manifestos and the like.
Well, as I say, I'm strongly committed, and as you pointed out, have discussed this well before I was Defence Secretary. So I am very committed to making sure that we defend ourselves. And when you do, I think you make a very good case to your adversaries not to try it on. So I think it's actually cheaper in the long run to do that as well. And I'm very pleased that we're committed to doing it. Of course, I urge us to do that as quickly as possible. There's a general election coming up.
Eric,
Is number 3?
4-ish. Yeah.
4-ish, number 4. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm completely lost with all the questions. Can I just, if we talk about the facts, can we just come back to the budget earlier this month? Is it a fact that there was no additional money for defence?
This budget didn't announce additional lines of expense, but because there's already been supplementals, including Ukraine and Dreadnought, the money still went up. But that's correct.
You refer to the facts, so it's correct. There was no additional money, right?
Yeah.
So, given that you and in fact, even yesterday on the floor of the House, that ministers are now saying we're in a pre-war situation. What is it you believe convinced the Chancellor and the Prime Minister not to put any additional money in to the budget for defence, given we're in a pre-war situation?
So although there was no announcement specific in the budget, as I was just saying, there was already money that had been pledged. So a couple of months earlier, for example, an increase in defence spending in Ukraine. Now, I hear what the committee said, that's not core defence spending, I hear some people say. Nonetheless, actually, there is a war on in Europe, and frankly, I don't really care whether the money comes in as a supplemental or...
So do you agree with the decision of the Chancellor and Prime Minister not to put additional money
into
the budget?
Look, I'm Secretary of State...
I'm asking you a simple question.
Okay, I'm Secretary of State for Defence.
Yeah,
I've been Secretary of State in many different departments, and by the way, always pretty successful in getting the money into whether it's energy or transport infrastructure, what have you. I intend to be successful
you agree with the Prime
in this
Minister and
role
Chancellor?
As well. I also have collective responsibility, and that means that this is a whole government budget. I'm very pleased. I actually am the...
Did you make representations for additional money to the Chancellor?
Well, I think it's widely known that of course I made representations. What kind of Secretary of State wouldn't?
You don't agree with the Chancellor and Prime Minister then?
Because I'm Secretary of State for Defence, I think that it should be a priority, of course.
So you made representations for additional money. The Chancellor and the Prime Minister rejected that.
Saying that they'd already put more money in, and that's revealed in the 1.8%.
So why did you ask for more money then?
Because, of course, every Secretary of State's job is to lobby for their area.
Why specifically did you ask for more money?
Because every Secretary of State wants to get more money.
What was the reason you asked for more money?
Well, there are any number of things that I'd like to spend the money on.
Like the committee. What was it in defence that you needed extra money for?
Well, I can go through a long list. There's almost no programme that I wouldn't want to enhance.
Let's take
improve.
the top one, 2 or 3 programmes.
It's hard to give you a sort of exact list, but there's almost nothing that I would want to do.
What specifically worried you that you needed to ask for extra money?
Because we are committed to going to 2.5%. I wanted to put forward the argument.
The question I'm asking.
I know, but you're not even letting me answer a question.
You're answering it.
I'll try if you let me.
I'll be silent for a minute.
We're committed to going to 2.5%. Of course, the Secretary of State for Defence, I argue that we should do that as soon as possible. As Secretary of State in many different departments now, I have always argued, and often successfully, you don't win that every single time. The view of the government on this occasion was there's already more money due to come to defence. Indeed, although it's in a supplemental, we'd already announced an increase on the Ukraine spending. If that had been done in the budget, you would have probably been telling me there had been an increase. So it's a question partly of timing, but there are many different fiscal events, and the trajectory is in the right direction.
I think the General Government wants to come in. Does he feel that? So what is it that made you feel we've got to get to 2.5 now?
I made speeches about
the Prime
this.
Minister didn't agree with you.
Look, I've made speeches about this. I believe that rather than going back to 2%, which is your party's policy, we should go up to 2.5%.
We've established that you and the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, agree.
2% NATO.
No, it's not. But, Chair, in fairness, that is not the situation. But let's stick to the government and their position. So basically, we have agreed that you asked for additional money. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor rejected it. So therefore, you don't agree with the decision of the Prime Minister and Chancellor.
Well, I agree.
Not putting money in the budget.
Well,
General, you wanted to come in.
Hold on. No, you put a point to me which I don't agree with. I agree with collective responsibility, right? So, of course, every Secretary of State bids for more money. You don't always get that money. And then to sort of turn that round and say, oh, therefore you don't agree with the overall budget, defies the point of collective responsibility.
So by not getting to 2.5 now, or in fact 3%, what does that mean what does that mean in terms of defence? What does that cause as a problem with?
Well, right now, the good news is that we're able to cover all of our NATO operations and do everything that I've ever wanted to do since I've come in. For example, sending troops to Kosovo, being active in the Red Sea, providing increased support to Ukraine, all of which I've done including Ukraine, because I have got a bit more money, although I know it seems to be resistant to accepting that when we look at the National Audit Office will agree with me at the end of the year that we spent more money, which will, if we can come back in a year's time, we can demonstrate the point.
General, you wanted to come in. Sorry, Chair.
Well, just Mr. Twigg, I think we're on record in this committee declaring the sorts of things in addition to the programme of record that we wish to invest in. Yeah. So asking the Secretary of State, I think we've already answered that. We've discussed the sorts of things and go through them again.
Did you go with the Secretary of State to the Prime Minister asking for these?
Exactly as the Secretary of State has said. We said we want additional resource. If we want to mitigate this level of operational risk, then we would need more resource in these areas, and we can go through those areas again. Yeah.
Just give us a quick few seconds, just so we get on the record again what these
We've been very clear that the amount of money we're spending on munitions at the moment, which is significant, it does not meet in all areas the threats that we face. We've been clear that we need to spend more money above the programme of record on what we call integrated air missile defence. Yep. I could go on. We've said these things before.
It's good.
So just to say that we have made it clear, if we were given additional money, what we would spend the money on. But we work within the money we've got, and we carry the operational risk accordingly. And that's what we're doing in 24-25. Yeah. Against the budget, the operational risk is at a certain level.
You clearly felt it important enough to go and ask for this additional money for those reasons. Okay, thank you, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you, John. Now, you want to come in very quickly, Martin, before we go to Gavin?
Yeah. Secretary of State, let's go back to the Public Accounts Committee's report, where the Right Honourable Member, I believe, for Hackney South and Shoreditch stated in the opening remarks, in an increasingly volatile world, the Ministry of Defence's lack of credible plan to deliver fully funded military capability, as desired by government, leaves us in an alarming place. But this problem is not new. Year on year, our committee has seen budget... That's what happens when you do technology. Year on year, our committee has seen budget overruns and delays in defence procurement. A lack of discipline in the MOD's budgeting and approach has led to an inconsistent plan that just isn't a reliable overview of the equipment programme's affordability. Do you recognise anything of any truth in the Chair's comments in that opening remark?
They're all wrong.
I think it would be disingenuous to sort of claim that procurement has been a consistent triumph in defence over many decades, and is one of the reasons why, and you'll recall perhaps my last appearance or the one before, when I first became Defence Secretary, I agreed that we should have a new system of procurement called the Integrated Procurement Plan, and indeed offered your committee the opportunity to be part of creating that. And that's something that we launched last month in response to precisely those concerns.
Let me briefly then
That
just...
question first. You done, Secretary of State?
Yeah, just to briefly, because I know that the Chair wants to bring others in, just in terms of the procurement and the whole processes through the Ministry, the report does then go on to say, and we will disagree, for example, on the nuclear deterrent, but our role today is to hold power to account in terms of how it manages that money. So in terms of the nuclear budget for the coming decade, it's stated it's jumping from 38.2 billion in 1 year to more than 109 billion. How does that then impact any additional spending on your conventional force if you have inflationary and also the issues around currency movements?
So the principal increase in the cost of the programme is linked to the deterrent, as you say, and that's as a result of us really doing a drains-up review of what we needed to ensure that we went through a decade of major recapitalisation with appropriate contingency and funding to make sure that we could deliver those critical programmes. The central budget assumption that we used, and I think as I explained to the Public Accounts Committee at the time, in terms of formal budgets, I have good confidence, including the supplementaries, for 24-25, but then we are into a spending review, so the issues will be decided through that process, and indeed over a 10-year horizon, there's always more than one spending review to go. The central budget assumption that we've used assumes that the nuclear programme is funded to a line that we've discussed and agreed with Treasury colleagues, and that Treasury assumptions about how the rest of the budget might grow are there for conventional capabilities. But that central assumption doesn't, as the Secretary of State has already said, plot a trajectory towards 2.5%, which is the government's position.
Just finally, Chair, there is a rather insane rumour going around at the moment that we've been hearing about today, that with the unarmed Trident missile misfire earlier, I think was it last month, that a member of the Cabinet may actually have been involved in the firing of that missile. What? Now, I'm wondering, Chair...
I can absolutely, although we don't discuss national security issues, I can absolutely guarantee
that no member of the government was involved in that. Thank you.
Settle that one?
Yeah.
Good.
It's not one I've heard either, I should say.
You learn something new every time you come to the committee, Secretary of State. Gavin, we're now on to military capability.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I do think, Secretary of State, good afternoon to you, that there is some overlap in the questions that you've faced up until now, but I hope at the outset you would accept that across all of the parties represented around this table, none of them present an electoral threat to me in Northern Ireland, and therefore I will not be electioneering in my questions. But I hope you would also accept that it isn't sufficient to simply outline that because you're the Secretary of State for Defence, you just naturally ask for more. You always want more. That for a Member of Parliament like me and colleagues around the table, the imperative is actually about defending our national sovereignty, our national defence, our readiness, our ability to respond to threats and prepare appropriately for them. So not in the abstract, hopefully you'll accept, not in the abstract just because you're Secretary of State you ask for more, but actually yes, you should be asking specifically and purposefully for the capacity and capability that we require to defend our nation.
I agree entirely.
Thank you. And you were asked to give an example of the sort of things you were seeking additional funds for, but you haven't done so. Do you wish to give an example of those now, over and above what the General said? Because I think it's important from a national perspective that you as the Secretary of State for Defence have the opportunity to indicate where you do think there are financial frailties within your department and what capacities you do require and that we require as a country for the future.
Well, a number have been mentioned. The reality is that there are a vast range of different things and future weapons that I would like to spend more time on and inevitably, in the end, more money. I mean, it's always been thought through the decades we fought with 3 different services, land, air and sea, but now we increasingly do much more in cyber and a huge amount more required also in space. So we've got more domains that we're fighting, so there'll be expansions there. We've talked about the replenishment because of our generosity and our gifting to Ukraine. And this is a question of how much risk you want to carry at any one moment in time. and it sits both within defence, because, as you rightly say, it's the first task and job of any government to defend the nation. And by the way, as the country who has the second largest NATO budget, with a blip for Germany at the moment because they've got a sum of money going through, but it's not in their baseline core at all. We do pull our weight when it comes to the NATO contribution, but I want to build systems which keep us safe for the future, and in particular deter our enemies from trying it on. And I think for all of those reasons, I can see where we'd spend money. But I would say, I hope with the agreement of this committee, it's not just about how much money you have, 55.6 billion this year, it's about how you spend the money. And that's why the integrated procurement model, the new plan to actually spend money in a much better way, I think is incredibly important. And lastly, and here we have been able to do things, I think the nature of warfare is shifting and changing, even in the 6 months that I've been in this job. Even in that time, in my visits to Ukraine, I'm seeing on the front line in actual war situations assumptions which would never have been the case 6 months ago. For example, Ukraine's sinking large amounts of the Black Sea fleet without themselves having a navy is changing the way that we look at warfare as well. So drones, sea and air, those are all areas where I think there's a lot more room for new thinking in defence.
Yeah, but you'll also accept that sometimes we are faced with choices. You're faced with a choice that is constrained by an earlier decision made in different circumstances. So as a Member of Parliament for East Belfast, where in-laws are made, for example, we saw their incredible utility in the early months of 2022 and the renewed interest in that system, but recognised that through UK defence it was discontinued 10 years ago.
Yeah, and we've seen lots of weapons that aren't new. I mean, the Storm Shadow is another example, like the N-Law, which is actually not a particularly modern missile, but has been incredibly effective. But there are new generations of missiles and others coming along all the time.
So what opportunity have you as Defence Secretary taken then to reappraise decisions that were made prior to your appointment as Defence Secretary, which in light of Ukraine and an full invasion of a country within our European territory, have you reappraised
I'll give you a couple of examples. Any navy which was thinking as it was a year ago about both its own defence, as we've seen in the Red Sea, and also its own attack, isn't thinking about the consequences of what's happened both actually in the Red Sea and also in the Black Sea, where we've seen an asymmetric level of warfare in both ways. So in the Black Sea with regard to drones at sea, and in the Red Sea drones in air, and the asymmetric nature of either sinking a Russian warship or firing expensive missiles like Sea Vipers at inexpensive drones. You're seeing an asymmetry which should make us all think about the way that we're doing things. And I recently highlighted the work of DSTL with the Dragonfire, for example, which has the potential for £10 a shot to, for example, take down a drone. So how fast can we bring these things forward? What's the progress? So those are the types of differences in thinking that are going on right now.
Mr. Williams mentioned in his last answer that there is a forthcoming spending review, and we know that in 2021 there was a spending review that led to the reduction in scale or the cancellation of a significant number of programmes. 2021, in advance of Ukraine's invasion, in advance of resurgent Russia, in advance of threats from China. And you know that the consequences, we got a list of the decisions taken from 2021 just last week. That included the cancellation of the Warrior Infantry vehicles, that included the reduction of E7 aircraft from 5 to 3 platforms, and knowing what training and maintenance and so on is required, that's really very few for utility purposes. Have you looked at those decisions from 2021 and gone through them to see where the assumptions prior to the invasion of a sovereign country in Europe right? So do they sustain today?
So first of all, I mean, every department has to cut its cloth at some point and live with it before it. 21 obviously was well before my time. What's interesting when I do look through those programmes is there are quite a lot of things which you look at today and say, actually, I'm not sure that would be the right programme to pursue. And as I say, only in the last couple of years during the war and even the last 6 months, there'll be a whole batch of new things that you would want to do. So we have turned on new programmes in areas, not all of which can be discussed in this forum, but nonetheless areas where there wasn't even an industry related to it going back a year or two. So I think that list would inevitably be quite different.
So if the list would be if the list would be quite different, Chair, then in what way? What is it that will be resurrected from the cancelled state, or
I was going to say, why don't we bit of expertise from someone who's actually
General
here?
McGann want to comment. So actually, I wasn't there. I wasn't there at the time. But the list I sent you is the down arrows from SR21. But it was a set of down arrows in order to create financial headroom alongside substantial increased investment in defence for the investment.
It's cancellation of
cancellations
plans.
and deferrals. No, I get that, but it was a set of decisions to retire capabilities, many of which were coming towards the end of their service life, in order to create, with the additional investment in defence, headroom for investment in future capabilities, and that was a deliberate risk judgment taken at the time about securing the future and taking risk in the short term. Now, with the invasion of Ukraine, the risk you're willing to take in the short term and when you want that future to arrive is a live question that we have been working through in our plans and is reflected in part in the snapshot in the equipment plan from last year. But as the Secretary of State says, both the pace of technological change and the evolution of capability that we're seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine means that rather, I think, than reprieving savings that we made in 21, if there were more money available, we will want to invest in new capabilities that are appropriate to the way in which we want to fight in the future.
Yeah, I recognise that you've got time constraints, but I think some of the answers will require further exploration at a future date, because reducing aerial surveillance, reducing the platforms, retiring the E3, changing the availability of investment in joint air-to-ground missiles, and all the rest of it seems to jar quite considerably with the requirements that are acknowledged.
Well, I want to try and reassure the committee. First of all, we're absolutely observing, as everyone is, what's going on in Ukraine, and we are applying the lessons of Ukraine, but we're not going to over-apply the lessons of Ukraine. NATO is not fighting in Ukraine, and so NATO will fight in a different way because of a whole range of circumstances. Having said that, it's very easy to have a conversation about capability and say, well, we should have not deleted this then because we need it now. But we're having a more fundamental review for the Secretary of State over the next 6 months. And that's about how are we going to fight in the future and how are we going to structure ourselves to fight in the future. And because of that, and we're going to fight and deter in a very different way than we have before, because of the lessons we're learning from Ukraine and other areas, that will lead us to, very quickly, through the summer, into a review next year of a range of capability choices associated with how we're going to fight and how we're going to structure. But I think it's too binary to just go down a list of kit to determine what we do or don't need.
It may be, and we shall see where the review goes, but I would make the point that you're not the first individual in such a uniform, in such a seat in this committee, to talk to us about a fundamental review, cycle after cycle, year after year, new ways of doing more with less, relying on allies and losing sovereign capability. And what happens? Defence never wins.
This is different because we've got a war in Europe.
It's always different.
Since 1945, a war in Europe, and we are shifting from a posture of campaigning, operating in certain regions of the world, to moving to a deterring warfighting posture. In my career, that is the most fundamental change in my career.
Yes, and I've been on this committee for 8 years, Chair, and we've seen 5 substantive reviews within defence, and on each and every occasion, the ability for our MOD and our services to respond to threats, their capacity, their size and their scale is reduced.
Well, we'll see.
Well, can I just say that if we're also being, Gavin's put one side of the coin, the other side may well be that the department has read thoroughly our report on readiness for war. The logic of that would be working out how we'd be fighting in these scenarios, learning the lessons from Ukraine. And I thought Mr. Williams's point in terms of the timing, that maybe in a pre-Ukraine environment, one would take a longer time frame to get state-of-the-art technology in, and perhaps one has to take decisions on timing is also another interesting theme for us to pick up on. So 2 very interesting points that I think have come out of that discussion for us to pick up on. On Ukraine, Richard, I think you're going to take us forward about kit.
I am. Good afternoon to you all. Secretary of State, do you agree that Ukraine cannot fall?
Yes.
Do you think, and the UK is leading and has led with equipment and help, and we should be proud of that, do you think that the West is doing sufficient to give Ukraine enough armour and so forth to keep the Russians at bay and one day take their country back?
I think it's insufficient.
Is there more that we could do? For example, a vehicle that I'm very familiar with, and others probably are too, the Warrior vehicle, which is being retired, hundreds of which have already been retired. We have 625, I understand. Has there been any consideration to give some of those to Ukraine?
Yeah. To give a slightly longer version, I do think that we need to do more. I think it's unthinkable that we would lose this war to Putin. I think we easily have the facility and capability not to lose this war, but it requires everyone to lean their shoulders into it. And I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago having exactly this conversation with Zelensky. I think that the catastrophic outcome of losing the war would be far more expensive than ensuring that Ukraine is in a position to win it. Mm-hmm. So I am, with that frame in mind, again looking through all of our stocks, including things which could be retired. Now 2 years on, things have moved on again, to have another scrub through the inventory. But more to the point, because we have been incredibly generous in our gifting, I'm also working on and with and on, I would say, our partners, of which there are 52 countries in the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, to make sure that they are also really digging deep to ensure that they assist. And so I look at, for example, our contribution in all things, including areas like long-range missiles, for example, but in many other areas as well, to make sure that we aren't an outlier whilst others aren't giving as much, and those things are very important.
We're playing our part, Secretary of State, there's no doubt, but if they're going to win this war, there's no doubt that they need an awful lot more kit.
Yes.
Billions of dollars worth of support is stuck in America.
Yeah.
Can you update the committee on where that is, and is it going to be forthcoming soon?
Anyone who can second-guess Congress in that manner, it would be a good person to have address you, and it's not. It's not me, but I'm
assuming. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
I'm assuming you ring your opposite number in the state and say, "Come
Yes.
on, this is absolutely crucial."
Yes.
Because as you said, the cost of protecting the eastern border,
Yep.
if Ukraine falls, would amount to hundreds of billions a
Yeah.
year.
My opposite number would entirely agree. Lloyd Austin would agree with that. It's stuck in Congress and specifically in the House, and for all manner of complicated internal reasons hasn't come out the other side. And I think it is therefore prudent for the rest of the world, and I don't just mean the West here, because, for example, I was in Australia last week and they feel very much the same way, because they would understand the read across from a loss to Putin would be that an autocrat elsewhere in the world might think of taking other territories. So this is, of the 52 countries in the Ukraine contact group, defence contact group. One is the United States. That still leaves 51 of us. And I think that the UK is in a natural place to show leadership in order to make sure that the coalition of the willing, which includes the US as an administration, but not as a Congress at the moment.
How many of those 51, Secretary, are actually willing? There's a lot of talk, not necessarily a lot of action. How often do you meet, perhaps virtually,
it's sort of monthly,
to say what does Ukraine need? They need this, for heaven's sake, give it to them.
It's a monthly meeting of the UDGC. And
every month that passes, thousands more die.
Well, I mean,
they're desperately short of shells, armoured vehicles.
Yeah, I mean that's
they don't have the manpower.
That's at the defence level, defence secretary level, but below that in other forums, for example, Jeff, the Joint Expeditionary Force, where I had a meeting with them the week before last about what more we can be doing to support Ukraine and how we can integrate them more into our work, which is work in progress. So there are many, many different ways, and the picture, just for the committee's interest, is not a straightforward one. There are huge challenges on the Eastern Front, as the committee will know, and that is a matter of making sure that Western munitions in particular get through. But in the Black Sea, almost the opposite is the case. 6 months ago, the Black Sea fleet sailed freely around the Black Sea. Putin had pulled out of the Black Sea grain initiative, and there was nothing being exported. 6 months later, not a single Russian Black Sea fleet ship is sailing at sea in the Black Sea, which is an extraordinary outcome, with Ukraine now exporting nearly as much as they did back in before the war.
The Russians are still making progress, albeit very slow.
Well, my point is they're making progress in one area and falling back in another area, is my point.
Yes, but you don't actually need a ship to take land. That's the infantry do that, as you well know. So the fact that ships are holed up is very good news, I accept, but the Russian troops are still advancing into...
There's a slightly wider point I'm making, which is that it has enabled Ukraine, and particularly Deputy Prime Minister Kubrakov, to get exports going again at a level which is helping them to fund their own economy and helping to fund weapons. So there's a broader point to that.
Fine, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Jesse.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Secretary of State. You said something I thought was very significant, which is there is no way we can lose this war to Putin. There's no way we can lose this war to Putin. And saying there is no way we can lose this war to Putin, I think absolutely rightly aligns directly our interest as a country and as part of Europe with what the Ukrainians are doing. And of course it underlines a further point you made, which is that there's a connectivity between each of these conflicts, because resolution, resolve, effectiveness are all being calibrated and measured across the different theatres of war, and therefore there's a tremendous signalling effect if we fall short in one, and others, our adversaries, can take comfort, possibly wrongly, from signalling. That's why the budget issue we had earlier is so important. Now, this is really I suppose this is a question for David Williams more than for you, Secretary of State, but you must come in if you want, which is, look, given that Mr. Wipperman's already said that the core planning budget has fallen in real terms, although the top-up supplementary budget has grown in real terms, has your planning capability, which has been highlighted by Mr. Robinson, deficiencies and the potential deficiencies of the past, has that planning capability been affected by the real terms reduction in funding?
Well,
because that's your planning budget, right? That's your core budget.
Okay, but without wanting to get back to the first 18 minutes of the hearing, when you add in the announcements that the government has made through various fiscal events, then
we know this, but that's not the core planning.
But
I'm asking you. Sorry, I don't want to get back to this. But has the core planning budget reduction affected your ability to do core planning?
No.
That's all I wanted to ask. Thank you. Is the fundamental review that General McGowan mentioned going to be something that takes account of the 5 previous reviews that we have had mentioned and discussed in this conversation, and learn the lessons on how it can be effective as a piece of internal negotiation as well as the process of deep reflection on our capability.
Of course, and there are people in the department that have got that knowledge as well, and we will pull on that and all those reviews to ensure that we do learn the lessons that Mr. Robinson was talking about. But this will be a new review, we hope, and we've got to be. It's got to be set against the current strategic context, which is different to the previous ones. But of course, we will look at what the mistakes we've made in the past and the successes we've had in the past.
Obviously, the deep worry is that changes in technology in particular just render some approaches to war overall potentially unviable, if not now, then over a 5 or 10, 15-year planning horizon.
Indeed, and that's why Minister of Defence Procurement, James Cartledge, on the floor of the House, when he introduced the integrated procurement model, made it really clear about this so-called spiral development, which will be inherent in the IPM, which is that a certain percentage of the funding for capability X will be set aside to ensure that it can meet exactly what you've just said, because the battle space in Ukraine is changing by the week, and let alone every year, and therefore that is one of the key lessons, that we have enough flexibility in our budget. Enough of it is not only uncommitted, but committed in a spiral way to a particular capability to ensure we can keep up with the technological change.
So part of the effect of that, just to be clear then, is not just that you get much more rapid, as it were, generational turnover in the way that a particular program is being moved forward, but you have a reserve that can act as a resilience pool against future technology change. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely that. And to be more agile, to be faster, there are a number of ways of doing that. But if I were allowed to say one thing, that is a much, much closer relationship with industry, literally sitting beside industry to ensure they can respond in an agile way that we need to in the future. That's a change.
Okay, that's very helpful. Can we just now go to Ukraine? We've already heard discussion about asymmetric war from the Secretary of State. We've heard discussion of drones, air, sea. Can you just highlight what you think the 3 or 4 leading technologies have proven to be, where we've been able to support the Ukrainians?
Yeah, so I think, without getting too technical here, but we can go as deep as you wish. If I were to say maybe 3 things off the top of my head, which we're seeing, well, it's not off the top of my head, this is driving the review that we've just been talking about. This so-called, what we're really seeing playing out in Ukraine, and we think will play out in future battlefields, battle spaces, this so-called sensor-shooter environment, where you have these sensors forward, and you have a lot more sensors, and they tend to be uncrewed sensors. And then you've got the shooters out of the battle space, out of harm's way, protected, that then can prosecute their fires through this forward screen. And that involves a very strong reconnaissance architecture, a very long-range precision fires, but also a command and control architecture to knit that together. So I just focus on that particular one. There are 3 or 4 others we could talk about, but that is quite a shift in the way we're going to fight in the future, and we're seeing Ukraine and Russia learning that very fast.
Quite. And therefore, if we were to contrast it with, as it were, the Bosnia conflict, another war in Europe, that was not, in some sense, an imperialistic war from an adversary we've been fighting directly, at least in the Cold War. This is that. They're rapidly evolving their forms of warfare. We're doing the same, and the nature of the electronic engagement that's being made is rapidly changing as a result.
Yes, but I think Bosnia is quite a useful case in point, that we're not going to fight Ukraine again. We're not going to fight Bosnia again. So it's finding the themes, but many people are charged with trying to reinvent, focus on the last war. So the clever bit is to identify what are those themes within Ukraine or Bosnia that we take forward to the future, and not replicate precisely what's happening, because it won't happen in the same way again.
Okay, so sorry.
I was just going to make a simple observation and projection, which is this is probably the first true drone war. And I don't think we'll ever see a war again which doesn't heavily involve drones.
By the way, I mean, we might, but not in a planning horizon, not in a generational horizon. I agree. Let me ask another, just to pick that up, though, and then I'll wind up. When we think about the way in which the theatre is changing, the battlefield and the wider strategic challenges changing in Ukraine, what are the kinds of trade-offs that you're seeing in your own procurement of existing equipment that will need to change in order to be able to shift resources into that newly thematic electronic war that you're talking about?
We've tried to go here before, and it's difficult to have those conversations for a number of reasons. I've been really clear that we will make those hard choices. We'll have to make those hard choices against the budget that we're given, whatever that is, to ensure that we can meet the drone battle space of the future. But what those trade-offs are, I mean, for two reasons. Commercially, it would not be appropriate to say that here. And this is an open environment. You wouldn't expect me to declare where I'm going to take operational risk in the future.
Thank you. Okay, that's extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed, Chairman.
Very interesting to see. Martin, you were very keen to come in, I think.
Yes, yeah.
As is Mark, and then it's on to the next.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Secretary of State, it's increasingly clear that for the necessity for Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression, it's not necessarily a lack of what we call formidability or the need for modernisation or some sense of new technological enterprise. What they require, what they keep telling us, is an old-fashioned triptych of more people, more ammunition and more time. I wonder if you would agree.
Half and half, actually, in reality, because yes, they need a lot more 155 and other calibre of ammunition. Yes, they need more people. They don't have endless supplies of people, and their country's not as populous as Russia. But they also need to play the asymmetric advantage. We had that conversation about the Black Sea, or the way that drones are being used. And actually, drones are interesting in as much as they belie the usual facts of war, which is usually every generation gets more expensive to have lethal effect. But actually, drones, which sometimes cost a few £1,000, can be extremely lethal, and you've seen that being used in this war in a way which we've recently given 325 million for drones. If that were being given for missiles, it wouldn't buy a lot of missiles. It would be a huge number of drones. So I think technological advantage is part of it, but yes, basic warfare and munitions and traditional stuff is also incredibly important.
But just briefly, I don't want to go into the drones at the moment. I'd be grateful. It would be good if we had more time for it, but we can't, because I know there is a concern around the glider drones specifically, and there might be an issue that the Russian Federation is getting access to Western technology to help them, but we maybe come back to that later. Specifically in terms of ammunition, I wonder if you can advise a committee around the Czech Republic's artillery shell shortage programme, where a substantial number of NATO allies are investing in that programme, which would allow, I think there's around about 800,000 identified stockpiles across Africa and Asia. Right, Russian Federation's firing around about 10,000 shells a day. The Ukrainians are only 2,000 return at the moment. Is your department investing in that programme?
So we work through what's called Kindred, which is our programme to obtain and provide things like munitions. So what we're doing actually
is... in that specific programme?
It's no, because we're coordinating to make sure that we don't compete with that programme, but we already provide a lot of munitions through international purchase, doing something very similar.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Secretary to state the obvious, some of the stuff about lowering the cost of lethal munitions clearly has an impact on non-state actors and their access to those, which we're seeing real time. Mark, you wanted to come in?
Generally, a few minutes ago, you announced something really very important, I think. You talked about a review ongoing within the department. Now, just for clarity, I take it you don't mean a complete defence review in the classic model, but how would you characterise it? Is this, if you like, a review of our war-fighting capabilities specifically? Is that a fair... Right.
It's called the Future Force Design Review.
The Future Forces Design Review.
Future Force Design Review. 3 elements: how we're going to fight, how we will structure ourselves to fight, and what are those capability choices. And that will form the golden thread of the military capability advice to the Secretary of State as part of a review, if we have one next year.
Okay, and so in the way of the MOD, that will now be the FFDR.
Right.
Okay, and which minister has day-to-day charge? It can't be Heapy, he's just resigned on a point of honour over the cuts. So which minister has day-to-day responsibility?
I talk about it day-to-day with Minister for Defence Procurement.
So it's Min DP who has the lead on it?
Indeed.
Okay, because he buys the kit.
Indeed.
That's very helpful, thank you.
Great. Emma.
Thank you very much, Chair. Afternoon all. Even though we were significantly hampered in our recent readiness report by the department, what we did conclude quite bluntly is that we are not ready for war. Now, we don't have the kit or the personnel to be ready. In November, Secretary of State, you told us that retention and recruitment was an area of concern for you, and yet we are continuing to lose personnel faster than we can recruit them. Have you yet seen the implementation plan for Haythornwaite?
So I do maintain that this is one of the biggest areas of concern. You're absolutely right to highlight it. I'll perhaps ask others to speak to the specific plan, but what I can tell you is that we are seeing a big increase in interest and applications, which I know is not the end of the story. But just to put it on record, a 6-year high in the Army in January, and I've just got the February figures, have come through as well, and again they're at 6-year highs. So,
Secretary, have you seen the implementation plan?
So the implementation,
because this is a priority for you. You told us.
That's right.
So have you seen the implementation?
So I've seen the implementation plan being worked up. I'm not yet happy with all elements of it, so we're carrying on working on it. David may want to add more to it.
I was going to ask David a question actually, because David, you told our committee that the plan would be with ministers before Christmas last year.
Yeah.
So it's taken from Christmas last year for you, Secretary of State, to now say you're not happy with that implementation plan. That's been quite a long time, considering you said this is a concern and it's something you want to look at pace.
Two observations, if I may. And then,
yeah, no,
sorry, unless you want to.
No, go you.
So, firstly, against the immediate pressures around recruitment, in particular, the Haythornwaite review and the recommendations that review made are relevant. They're part of the answer, but I think they're not sufficient. So one of the things that the Secretary of State has asked and the ministerial team have been getting from the people area of the department is a shorter-term focused, what are the immediate steps we need to do to recover on recruitment, and there's sort of a 12 or 13 step approach that the team is working on there. On Haythornwaite, the approach that we are taking to implementation is, pilot's really the wrong word, I think it's more of an early adopter, to work through 24 on a particular cohort around engineering personnel. That's around 10,000 people in the armed forces, to look at themes from the Haythornwaite review around total reward, around spectrum of service, around the skills framework, and to put those recommendations into practice with a specific cohort before broadening out. There are some...
David, can I just be clear then? So in terms of the implementation plan, nothing's been implemented yet. So
no,
the review was June 2023, the implementation plan was before Christmas, but nothing yet has been implemented around recruitment and retention from that implementation plan.
No, that's not fair. A range of activity is going on.
Can you give us an example?
We've been looking quite hard as part of our evidence to the pay review bodies about the place of financial retention incentives against core pay, against specialist pay, so getting into that sort of total reward space. So I think the point is that a full-scale implementation of the Haythornwaite review is is generally not a quick thing. It's a multi-year endeavour, and once we get after that, there's a bunch of stuff that we want to do because the challenges around recruitment can't frankly wait that long.
So shall I have a go at this as well? So as I said to you before, this is something that's just massively concerning me, and I accept before other members mention it that just because there have been applications and they're a record high for a lot of years doesn't mean they come through. And one of the things which frustrates me about the system is that you can apply, but actually getting into the armed forces through the system is painful. So I've been having regular meetings with the Chief of the Defence people. It's 13 themes that he's working on, along with Min DPF, he's now called, recently changed name. He and I have been working very, very hard to drive those changes. And I've spoken about quite a lot of them and already started to enact quite a lot of those changes. So, for example, I was up at Cataract recently talking to the person responsible for the army recruitment, who was telling me that it is ridiculous that once you've applied, you'll be invited for an interview. That interview takes place in a different location to the location for your medical. So we're bringing that together. I don't need to produce a report to do it. We're just doing it. I've spoken before about the fact that, and I know this can be a bit controversial, I don't personally have a beard, but 54% of men between 18 and 30 do. So we immediately exclude large numbers of people in most of the army, for example, and many, many other things which I'm able to move on and change. Not needing to produce a final report. But to answer your question, I haven't rushed to publish something until I'm happy with the process.
I suppose to cut the chase, and when will we actually see any of that plan come into fruition? When will it actually? What timeline have you give yourselves as a department for when you'll actually start to see changes?
To actually publish it as a formal piece of work rather than just doing the work.
To actually see the changes itself. That you're talking about. Yeah. When will we see them?
I think presently, actually, I mean, I've been more focused on trying to get the change within the system than publishing a report about it. But I think we can undertake to publish that fairly soon.
And I'm just curious if anyone can help me out here. I've been sent a recent FOI where it showed that over 125,000 applicants have been rejected from the army, including 23,000 from the Commonwealth, and they were turned down because of lack of vacancies. Is that correct?
I haven't seen that actual
that's what
FOI,
the
but
FOI says lack of vacancies was why they were turned down.
I haven't seen that actual one, but I know that in the army, I think there are like 73 different kind of routes that you apply for, rather different professions that you can apply into. And I don't know whether that's because some are full or not. I haven't seen that FOI, I have seen any number of examples of what I think are crazy practices in a modern world to go and recruit people. And this is a very, very strong focus for me, because I completely accept, particularly since there seems to be such high levels of interest, that the fact that we can't get them through the system is a real and genuine problem that needs resolving.
Okay.
May I challenge just your very first sentence, if I may, just for the record, that and I've absolutely read your report, and I think that many of those recommendations we're going to enact, but not yet ready for war. We are ready for war. We and I fundamentally believe that there will be a road to war.
And that's not what we concluded, though.
But we have
and
very
that was
high
based on the scant information we actually got. Nobody could explain to us why information that was previously publicly available is now classified. So we could only assume that it's because it's far worse than we actually think it is.
We have very.
You may disagree, but that's what we found as a committee.
No, I think your report is, from my perspective, from a military capability perspective, is exceptionally useful. But I think the message that this country is not ready for war is the wrong message on a whole range of fronts. We have very high readiness forces, many in the colour of my uniform, that can go out the door tonight, and we will have then a road to war. We would fight as an alliance, and it's all, as we've discussed before, it's about the balance of operational risk. That's the answer, not we're not ready for war. We are ready for war.
You'll have to disagree.
Right. Thank you, Emma. Mark, do you want to come and just...
Yeah, it follows directly from that, and then we'll come to personnel. General... There are 6 former MOD ministers on this committee, some other people who served, so we sort of vaguely know what we're talking about. We spent months looking at this. The MOD were very reluctant to release a lot of sensitive information. And if you're right and we are ready for war, and I hope you are, we're not ready for an enduring war.
Absolutely.
Yes, you accept that.
Absolutely.
The problem is, as we go into this in chapter and verse, but in a nutshell, for brevity, sir, we couldn't fight an enduring war for more than a couple of months against Russia. Drop all these euphemisms about peer adversaries. We couldn't fight Putin for more than a couple of months in a full-on shooting war because we don't have the ammunition and the reserves of equipment to do it. That's true, isn't it?
True.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for your candour. So, clearly, we need to do something about that. Hence our great concern about the budget, but I think we've made that point already. To give credit where it's due, this forced design review sounds good. It's very much along the lines of our report. If we're now looking, perhaps because of this, but for other reasons too, how we can increase our actual warfighting power, that's got to be a good thing. When will the FFDR conclude? When do we aim to have the outcome of that?
We have an outline now. It's obviously at a classified level. I don't know what sort of negotiation we could have a closed session on where we've got to on that. And that will mature. The key point is that it must be ready, assuming we have a review next year or the end of this year, whenever it is. We've got to inform that from a military capability perspective, from a operational design, force design, capability, choice perspective. It must inform that. So whenever that is, it'll be ready.
Well, Jen, I'm looking at the chair for the risk of speaking for the committee. Given the tremendous amount of work that we, and for the record, our excellent clerks put into this report, I think we would very much welcome a private briefing if this exercise is complete or near complete. I'm sure the committee would very much like to be briefed on confidential terms about what that is, and maybe we could sort that out. Secretary of State, is that reasonable?
That sounds like a very good idea. I'm very happy to facilitate that for you. Excellent. I just wanted to make one small point, only because with 6 former MOD ministers and lots of professional expertise here, this is taken as a given within this room. But for people watching and hearing that the UK isn't ready for war exclusively with Russia, it's important to understand that because we're in NATO and Article 5 exists, that we would never be in that situation. And in fact, if we were in a war against Russia, NATO has 4 times as many tanks, 3 times as many subs, 4 times as many helicopters, 6 times as many armoured vehicles, 4.5 times as many warships, 8 times as many transport aircraft, 4 times as many artillery and fires, 16 times the aircraft carriers, and 3 times as many fighters. In other words, we would be in a very strong position. The UK is very improbable, very unlikely that we would pick a war with Russia and not have NATO.
And in 1940, the French army was far larger than the German. Anyway, yes, let's come on to recruitment. Take you back to defence questions of only yesterday. I quoted to you in the chamber, or to MinAF, an article that Larissa Brown, the defence editor of the Times, wrote on the 22nd of March, where she quotes you. So very briefly, this from her article. Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, has admitted that the recruitment system is ludicrous, saying earlier this month that the Amazon generation, which is used to getting things instantly, were not prepared to wait a year to join the army. That is an accurate reflection of your position, so yes?
Yes.
Good, okay. Larissa's a good journalist. I didn't think she'd get it wrong. So if it's ludicrous, and I think this committee would absolutely agree with that, if it's ludicrous, why is the outsourced contractor, who the chairman has asked me to call Capita today, still on contract? Why, if it's ludicrous, haven't you bitten the bullet, got rid of them and taken it back in-house? I mean, ludicrous is your word.
Yeah, ludicrous is, my reason for ludicrous is not actually to do with the contractor, though I know you've made many representations. The strict answer is they're under contract, I think, extended for a year or whatever. I think they've been on a rolling contract for many years. My actual complaint is not specifically, although I'm sure there are many issues there, with just the contractor. It's that the rules that we apply, and we started to get into some of them before, mean that people who would quite clearly be assets to our armed forces are often not allowed into our armed forces. And it starts with trivial things like facial hair, but goes right through to whether in 40 years' time you might have a genetic disease that suggests that the actuaries say that you wouldn't be able to fight.
So if you had asthma when you were 3 and all
right, whereas most people serve for 10 years or something. So we've got to get real with the rules. So when I say it's ludicrous, I think the way that we're doing this is almost designed to put people through a salt course, which is about everything apart from their ability to actually fight.
I think we are in what the Americans would call violent agreements. Yeah. For brevity, given what the General has just said, in our report, Ready for War, page 31, para 75, one sentence, quote, the MOD publicly concedes that for every 8 service personnel who leave, it currently recruits 5 people, although we understand the situation may have deteriorated further, end quote. We understand in some parts of the army, for every one that Capita somehow managed to recruit, 3 are now leaving. And we're particularly losing trained specialists to industry where they can earn far more. And without those avionics technicians, your planes don't fly. Without those nuclear watchkeepers, your submarines don't go to sea, and so on and so forth. So it's really serious. The armed forces are bleeding out on the operating table. I mean, I use that language deliberately and based on fact. So a few tweaks aren't going to cut it. What this needs is for you, sir, to cut the Gordian knot and do something very different from what we're doing at the moment, especially in the army where the challenge is greatest. So you got your headline. What are you now going to do?
Hawthorne Waite, I think, proposed 67 or maybe 69 different pieces of action, and we're working through, or different themes, actually, I think.
Hawthorne Waite won't touch the sides. They're leaving now.
Well, in fairness, I think you've got to start somewhere with these things, right? So he has a whole bunch of different things which were putting people off either joining or staying. CDP, who you recommended to me.
Well, if you wanted to put that in the public domain, yes, I did.
It's right there. You told me it was excellent, and I found you to be entirely accurate. Is working day in, day out on this, as is Min DPF on it, and myself, because I stand by my words. I think a system which makes it troublesome for people to get in isn't in tune with the modern world. It takes far too long, and people have been offered other things and go elsewhere. In a fundamentally, and this is the issue, very, very tight labour market with low unemployment, that means that people have a lot more options. I mean, things like the 9% pay rise last year will have helped. And when I looked at, why are the applications up, part of the reason is the pay is up.
So just Secretary of State, sorry, can we dispense with this sophistry? Capita are past masters at manipulating statistics. So when you say applications are up or expressions of interest, that is not the same as enlistments.
Correct.
The whole problem on this contract for years is there's lots more people go on the website, click, say they're interested, maybe then go through the application process, but very few of them actually take the king's shilling. So I've seen ministers constantly talk about applications are up, but enlistments are down. What matters is enlistments. It's when people join, not when they watch a video. So please stop blowing smoke at us over that. We know the truth.
Well, look, I don't disagree with the difference between a click to apply and someone enlisting. So you're absolutely right about that. But it can't have been the case that in the last 6 years a defence minister has come to here and said that the army applications are at 6-year high, because they are at 6-year high, or 8 years with the Navy. So we are seeing a much higher level of application. I absolutely share your concern about getting them right through the system. And the problem is, and may well be related to the contractor, but my point is, if we think that's the only problem, then we are
one more go. Right,
there are many other things.
One more go.
One final go.
I understand. We've got 3 minutes. I understand. But look, recruitment is undoubtedly a challenge.
Yeah.
You must sack Capita. You must. But retention is an even bigger challenge. At some point, we've got to improve the recruiting, but what we've got to do is we've got to stop them leaving in droves, and they are. We visit military bases. It's our job. We talk to people more and more who are planning to leave. So if that's what you're going to do about recruitment, and you've got to sack them, sir. What are you going to do about retention?
Yeah. Well, first of all, pay people better, which was one of the things. That was the biggest pay rise in the public sector last year. Treat people better, and there've been entire reports on that. Make accommodation better, which has been this time last year. I was reading your output, not as Defence Secretary, about people waiting 12 weeks to get their boiler repaired, and like. Fortunately, say again.
Stick or twist report.
Yeah, stick or twist. Yeah. So and actually, we put this £400 million into improving the accommodation. It is starting to work. There's more we need to do on accommodation, including things I can't quite go into yet, but the committee will be aware of the structure of accommodation, but also the rules for who gets offered what, which you'll know that I acted on recently. So these quality of life reasons for being in the military are also very, very important things as well. So, there are so many different things we're working on the retention side. It's difficult to list them all here, but I entirely accept the premise that you both. A click of interest is not somebody enrolling. I totally accept that, and we also have to be better at the retention. I'm on this and sort of straining every sinew. I hear what you're saying about the contractor. My understanding is they're contracted for a period more, but there is a plan to change this entirely, which you're aware of as well. But my interest is making sure that we solve this. It's actually probably bubbled up to the number one issue that is in front of me. Retention.
Right, so thank you very much. So, Richard, wanted to come in quickly? Then Emma.
Very quickly, Secretary of State, on the length of time it's taken to get people into the army, and Capita, a lot of the blame has been laid at the door of Capita, and we've interviewed Capita here. When we raised this issue with them about previous illnesses or skin this or whatever it was when you were 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I used an example myself which raised their wrath a bit, they said to me, it's not us, it's the government. It's the MOD that actually sets the guidelines. We simply follow orders. Yeah. So if that is the case, and you've just said it is, what are you doing to give them separate orders to get people into the armed forces faster?
Quite simply, I've ordered the service chiefs to go back through some of these crazy rules and bring them up to date for the 21st century.
Right, well, the service chief's fine, but it's so, and they will tell Capita, will they?
Well, no, because actually...
Because Capita's the army, of course.
Capita's only the army.
Yeah.
And separately, even then, it's not just the contractor. I'm not trying to... I'm not trying to sort of protect them. I'm saying it is us. It is our people and our systems and our rule book which also causes the problem. But it's not just that, it's physical things as well. Like, you apply, you're invited for an interview, you go for the interview, you're told to come back 3 weeks later and go for a medical. So, well, 3 weeks in modern era, why wasn't the medical done when you got there? Yeah, why isn't it the same location? We haven't even got the estate right to do this in many places.
So that's going on now, is it?
Yes.
Right, okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. Just one more quick one from me. I remember when Mini F was before us and he said all the work around Hawthorne Way recruitment and retention wasn't going to be cost neutral. You've said to us today that you're on it. So can you tell us how much of your budget is actually allocated to resolving
That's interesting.
this issue?
I have to defer to a budget expert.
So our total personnel budget is about 44% of the RDL. So give or take.
44, did you say?
44% of our RDL, so just under 16 billion. That's military and civilian personnel. So it's within that, of which about 2 billion or so is, give or take, is civil service. So it's within that we all need to make it cost neutral, because that's the overall cost of our people.
We are, alongside development of the plan, we're working through what the plan will cost, and there will be choices in that. Cost neutral would be good. I suspect personally cost neutral over time is probably the best that we can hope for, and it will be a cost up front, but it's something we are still working through. That would be an issue we'll take into the next spending review, but in the meantime, where there are immediate actions that we want to get on with, then we're finding the money for it.
Okay. I'll let you move on, Chair.
Thank you.
John. Thank you, Chair. For a sort of initial... just before we leave that last subject, are we having problems also with delays in vetting of applicants? Because that seems to be fairly widespread across the department.
I haven't come across a vetting issue, but you may.
Well, they have, and indeed I think the NAO and your sister committee has looked at vetting in government. There have been a range of challenges in vetting that has led for us out of the Cabinet Office. There's been a recovery plan. I understand they're now hitting their key performance indicators, but that has been an issue for us previously.
What's the average delay now?
I don't have that information to hand.
And also how many are sort of well beyond that. If you could send us a note on that, that would be helpful. If I can then move on to equipment. And the NATO Defence Production Action Plan was signed, as you know, in Vilnius at their summit last year. What has been achieved as a result of it, and how is it being used to support the UK defence industry?
Well, as you know, the Prime Minister was public in Vilnius about what the UK is leading on the DPAP, as you've just outlined, Mr. Spello. And for the UK, that is munitions and missiles. And our Minister for Defence Procurement is also leading on the ground-based air defence programme across NATO. So it's people within my team now that are leading across the department to try to encourage, and ministers have written out to member states to join these particular programmes. And that's starting. There's nothing I can say that we've absolutely achieved a multi-member state contract against this particular capability, whether this standard of munition or whatever it is, but it is absolutely the aspiration that we will be saying something like that by the time we get to the Washington summit in July.
Remind me, when was the Vilnius summit last year?
I can't remember the exact dates, but it was
that's quite a bit of time.
July 23. I can't remember the exact date in July.
It's gone by, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
You said we're starting.
Yeah, it's hard. It's 32 member states and trying to, but we know how important it is. As the Secretary of State said about 20 minutes ago, we're going to fight as an alliance. We fight as NATO, and therefore having commonality of munitions, commonality of missiles, air defence systems is important. But as we've said before, the weakness of the alliance is the alliance, but the strength of the alliance is the alliance, and so we've got to work through that.
32 are going to be involved,
and we're not looking for 32 either. We're not looking for 32 either. We haven't written out to 32. We've written out to those member states that we think have the industrial capacity and the requirement to meet the same needs as us.
If I may, the Defence Ministerials, I think in February, just to bring up to date, we agreed in principle, I think, with 14 partners, 13 or 14. A willingness to engage on both the munitions and the missiles, multinational.
It's 15. 15 in total.
And as the General says, the intent through the engagement now is to both aggregate demand and get to some specific procurement proposals, which ideally we'll be able to announce by the Washington summit. We're also doing quite a lot of work on NATO standardisation, both thinking about how they are fit for purpose and ensuring that we are following those. And there's quite a lot of work going on through Mr. Stark, who's our National Armaments Director. General Robb is the Deputy National Armaments Director, around how you use that aggregated demand signal to increase industrial capacity, whether it's having that conversation in a NATO context rather than, for example, the EU defence industrial strategy that's recently been launched.
Just on that, the thing that we signed at NATO in February is the Multinational Procurement Initiative, MPI, and it was a UK initiative, and we brought 14 partners with us, so that's the 15 partners in it.
All of that's encouraging, but at the same time, it's not about being ready for war. There's a war on at the moment, and there does not still seem to be that sense of urgency. Secretary of State, you very kindly wrote to me in response to questions that I've been raising in Parliament about the 155mm, and you said in that in that letter, following a significant increase in the requirement for 155mm artillery ammunition in April of 23, the Ministry of Defence worked with BAE. The need for 155mm ammunition was clear back in 22. And indeed the United States were responding much earlier. New York Times of January in 23 said the Pentagon was racing to produce production of all artillery shells by 500%. They're building a whole new capacity down in Dallas, and they're also, I can't remember whether it's an explosives or a propellants capability in Arkansas. And yet we only signed our agreement with BAE in July of 2023. Don't we have a system problem in responding to crisis?
Obviously, it's before my time. I do know, and I think I probably mentioned in that letter, we're now doing an 8 times the level of 155 production with that signing. And I noticed that Germany, even later than that, have finally started to build a factory which will look to produce more munitions. But if the general charge is, the world's too slow to produce and provide things to this existential war in Europe, then frankly I agree. I think probably to defend my predecessors and the department, I think many people will have hoped that the war will have been over quicker, and perhaps munitions, and particularly things like 155s, which were largely being purchased from elsewhere in the earlier stages of the war, would have been sufficient. But we are where we are. We have really stepped up. And you use the American example. I will use this public forum to say it would be wonderful, and I think in America's own interests, if they can now get some of that ammunition to Ukraine, because it's one thing being able to manufacture it, it's another thing being able to help Ukraine, and they don't have to do it because in the United States Congress it's Europe asking for it, and there's somehow we're trying to claim there's some moral reason for them to come and help on another continent, but through their own self-interest of ensuring that dictators elsewhere don't think that you can take advantage of the Western coalition by simply waiting for us to get some form of attention deficit after a couple of years of war. So I think for all those reasons it's important that new manufacturing capacity gets to Ukraine.
But even if the requirement for Ukraine ended tomorrow, way back again in 22 and all the way through 23, it was crystal clear that the security environment in Europe had changed dramatically and that we were going to require to be on a better war footing. The previous Armed Forces Minister seemed blissfully unaware of the evidence of General Hodges to this committee, previous head of the US Army in Europe, that in an exercise the UK Army ran out of munitions in 10 days. And the General was saying that for a major war that we would run out of materials, I think a month or so. So it was clear that situation had changed. But there doesn't seem to be the initiative inside the system to move this forward. How are you going to change that?
One of the things that is one of the supplementals, so controversially not in the Red Book, but it is for the weapons stockpile, which is very important. And it might be that the General wants to come in.
Well, this goes back to the point I was discussing with Mr. Francois. We absolutely agree that we need to endure in a war, yes. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't absolutely responding to what you've just said. And we're absolutely doing what you've just said. We've written a munitions strategy. We're now developing a plan. We are determined to commit a certain level of munitions over a certain period of time. Industry have helped us write these documents. And so the point you're making is absolutely critical to war fight in an enduring way. And that is probably my number one priority in terms of what we go to work every day.
Industry needs contracts in order to do that. Can I just...
Absolutely. Although, if I may, Mr. Speller, I mean, the contract, if you like, was the sort of the culmination of a process of engagement. So for BAE Systems on ammunition, for Thales actually picking up the production run of NRAW again, for MBDA, we had signed... Now, I would have to go and check whether it was late 21 or early 22, but a set of letters of comfort for those companies to begin investing in production capacity while we work through what our requirement would be and what a contract over a number of years might then look like. So it's not that we thought about it in April 23 and then signed a contract. It's the culmination of that.
I should also, just for completeness, mention the International Fund for Ukraine, which despite its name is actually a British fund which we invite international partners to join, which has now raised over £900 million and laid 27 separate contracts for lots of things, including munitions. So we haven't been sitting on our, backsides.
And a long-term procurement for a particular company, it will be made public very soon. We've just had approval.
Okay, if I could just move on to Boeing, because your predecessor paused the contract for the Chinooks coming in, but you've now gone ahead with that. How many Chinooks are we ordering? Which variant? And what's been the costing?
The 14, the extended range type. I looked at this very, very carefully, just in terms of context on this, and visited the US as well on it, with a completely open mind about potentially not going ahead. There was a very large cost to not going ahead, given where the plan had got to. But actually, because my predecessor had frozen it, I was also able to go back and negotiate essentially a hefty discount, some £300 million on it. And also, I think more importantly, used it as a discussion to also obtain FMS reform, which is costing us hundreds of millions of pounds, because although we've never been refused a piece of equipment that we were trying to buy from the States, we constantly come up with delays, which could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, before we get approval, even though, as their closest ally, we'd always end up getting approval. And that process itself was causing us to have to delay, backfill, and make financially inconsistent decisions. So I think actually, although the £300 million off is the sort of top line, the FMS reform is actually the more important part from my perspective, and I was pleased to be able to get pledges on that front.
So you saved 300 million and so what was the original price and what's the price you paid?
Yeah, so I haven't got the numbers in front of me.
The price we paid is 1.5 billion.
1.5 million.
Yeah.
Billion, sorry.
Yeah, 1.5 billion.
So that's over 100 million a craft, a platform, yes.
Well, it includes the sustainment costs as well, through life.
What do you mean by sustaining costs in that context?
Well, in terms of the ability to ensure that you can operate them. You buy them, but you've got to operate.
Does that mean they're going to maintain them? Is this a service contract or is it a sales contract? Who's actually going to maintain them then?
Boeing. Boeing.
Boeing are going to do all the maintenance on the...
Currently, we have a contract with Boeing for Apache and Chinook. And in fact, we are going through a process now where we're going to make that more efficient. In this country, that's run from both Apache and Chinook. Maintenance is run from the United Kingdom.
But Boeing have had history of reneging on some of these arrangements and suddenly taking the work back to the States. I've experienced that. But so you're saying that the 100 million per is a through-life contract for each one of these, which includes their maintenance and upgrades as well.
We'll have to get you I think out of committee we'll have to get you the breakdown of the costs associated with the CDL purchase and the running costs and how that's being managed.
I think
we'll provide that all for you.
That would be very helpful. One final question, Chairman. Were any members of the government on board the submarine with the failed missile?
I was. But I just wanted, just for clarity purposes, perhaps mention that the slightly odd language of an event-specific anomaly actually was in relation to a piece of test equipment which is not on an actual missile fire. So the reason that the recertification was able to complete was that the ship performed perfectly, the crew were exceptional, the actual firing out of the sub worked perfectly. Without the piece of test equipment, this would have hit targets, so in a live fire it would have been on target, which is why the boat, rather than the ship, was able to go back into recertification.
Just as a matter of interest, is it usual, because these happen from time to time, is it usual for ministers to be on board? I'm not sure.
I do not know.
In my experience, yes. No. I mean, for the particular Dato firing, there is normally a US and UK VIP delegation.
All right. Can I just come back to Chinook very quickly? This is according to an MOD briefing note. Yeah, this is your note. The E7 Wedgetail, the AWACS aircraft, years late, 10% UK content. The A864 Apache, 7% UK content. The P8 Poseidon, 4% UK content. Previous CH-47s, it says here, 2% UK content. So that's virtually nothing in the UK. And when you add those four programmes together, you are talking billions and billions of dollars. And you've just spent £1.5 billion in sterling to buy these helicopters from a company that's just wiped out its own senior management. So hang on. When you do us this note to clarify the costs of the contract, what's paid for, what's the additional support costs, you're going to give us chapter and verse. Could you also clarify how much of that is going to be spent in the UK?
Yes, and that's why we produced this note. This is the note in terms of what to answer that question. But since the conversation we had last time and produced the note, I've personally been to Boeing in Crystal City, and I've relayed this conversation. The next negotiation we're going to have with Boeing is on Chinook Tranche 2, so the replacement of our current model. And I'm going to go along with our National Armaments Director, the head of DNS, Andy Start, to have a conversation with Boeing. If our replacement for the current Chinook is the next block, so-called Block 2, it will be exactly along the lines you've just said. That how are Boeing going to continue to invest in the United Kingdom?
So
if
you
we're
say
going to pursue...
continue to invest. We've spent billions and billions with them over the last 20 years, and what they give back to British industry is peanuts.
The situation is changing with Boeing.
I know they've all been sacked.
Can I just jump in as well on it? So I think there are a lot of problems on the civil side, which you pointed out. I agree, we want to procure here. That's why we've got the integrated procurement model. That's why you guys have helped us in developing that model. One of the things that it does is it massively increases the ability to export as being part of the competitive process, plus all the spiral development we talked about before. And when it comes to a helicopter in particular, like the Chinook, there isn't, apart from, I think, a Chinese knockoff, there isn't anything else which can do what that does. And this one will do it for twice the distance as well, which will be of great use potentially to our special forces and others. So I think that, you're right about your concern, but I actually also think we've got a plan, in part because of this committee's work, for making this better in the future, which I look forward to doing.
There's a reason why that's the only option, and that's because MOD, and the RAF in particular, has consistently not placed their orders with British industry and has placed it with American industry. So not only is it expensive, not only are we being affected by the dollar-pound exchange rate, but also we become dependent on them, and they know it.
Which is why we're so pleased with this plan that you've helped us with.
Let's move on. I want Martin to have 5 minutes, which takes us over time, on the National Defence Plan. This is a very, very quick answer, I hope, to a very good question. ESG, we saw the announcement in the budget that the FCA are going to be looking at the ESG rating providers. That isn't something you've neglected. I'm sure you're going to carry on pushing it. I mean, there's a moral imperative here that we don't get anywhere. We don't get schools and hospitals that we want if we haven't got peace and security. And I hope that this is a message that the department is constantly pushing out.
I feel incredibly strongly about it when I hear from financiers who refuse to back defence, and I tell them about the school or the nursery that was bombed out for the Ukrainian family who came and stayed with me, and I went to see that those actually flats across from the kindergarten. I say to these financiers, how can the moral thing be to allow for that to happen and not to be prepared to finance the defence of defenceless people at the moment in Ukraine and elsewhere? So, in my view, there's absolutely an open and closed case for investment in defence, and I think that's the moral stance.
Thank you. Secretary, I hope you don't mind if we just run over by 3 minutes, just to allow Martin to have his last question, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And just in terms of the department currently working on the National Defence Plan, I wonder if you could maybe, in terms of strategic readiness, say something about interdepartmental working and also about how, if permanent secretaries are engaging not only across departments here in Whitehall but across Cardiff, Edinburgh, and of course there'll be different arrangements for the civil service in Northern Ireland.
A very good example of interdepartmental working yesterday with the launch of the command paper, the nuclear command paper. The Prime Minister and Chancellor were up in Barrow, and that involves defence, levelling up, DFE on qualifications, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was an extraordinary number of departments involved. So it's very good sort of, and making things like nuclear a national endeavour has really shifted that in a big way. The other thing is I spend a lot of time, defence is clearly very international in nature, so barely a week goes away when I don't leave the country. Last week into the weekend I was in Australia with the Foreign Secretary. We do a lot of 2+2 type of work, so there's a lot of integration there as well. But there'll be many different examples.
And to the second part of your question, if I take a step back and think firstly more broadly about resilience and strategic risk, permanent secretaries, including colleagues from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, are routinely and increasingly discussing questions around resilience, around risk, including shocks to the continuity of delivery of public services, not just in a defence context. We have joined up work around the national security risk assessment and our expectation on the National Defence Plan, working both with the National Security Secretariat and then the resilience part of the Cabinet Office, is that this will support and prompt a broader conversation about a whole-of-government view rather than simply a military contribution to it. So it's a theme, I think, partly building on our collective experience during COVID, partly thinking about the risks from an increasingly dangerous world, thinking, topical this week in Parliament, about the cyber threat. Resilience is a conversation across the sort of group of permanent secretaries on a routine basis.
And just in terms of Parliament, how do you do that? How do you have that engagement with us as parliamentarians to ensure that we're on board? Well, politically we may have disagreements in certain policy areas. In terms of readiness, how do you involve parliamentarians in that discussion?
So I think actually just going back to this integrated procurement model, this would be a good example of certainly the way I'd like to work. And I came to this committee, I proposed or was asked whether the committee could be involved. The committee was involved before we actually published the plans to comment on it. I think it's a better document because of it. That would be a very good example, and I think it's a very useful way to operate.
And just finally, I hope you don't mind me asking, but the Prime Minister this morning stated very clear that Ministers of Government should comply with public inquiries if asked to. I wonder, as Secretary of State for Defence, if you agree with the Prime Minister.
Of course.
Thank you.
So lastly, timings on the defence plan.
It's just been through sort of senior level official consideration. It will be submitted to ministers shortly, but it's really about teeing up some investment choices alongside the, I'm tempted to say FFDR now, the force design work that the General is leading. So we are thinking both about capability choices for warfighting abroad alongside capability choices for defence of the UK.
Might we see something public by the summer recess?
I don't think you'll see something public by this summer recess, and in any case the plan itself is quite classified. I think there's something for us to explore, as the Secretary of State suggests, about what a closed session engagement with the committee might look like as we develop and refine the plan.
Thanks, sir.
We've covered a lot of ground. It's been a very helpful session. Thank you all very much, Secretary of State, Mr. Williams, Mr. Wipperman. General, much appreciated, and thank you. And I close the session. Thanks.
Ended. The proceeding has ended.